Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. I've been wanting to experiment with buttermilk in yeast bread, and that's not common. But I wanted to make some sliders, so I looked and couldn't come up with anything I liked. So I sort of put together this recipe, and the results was wonderful. So I'm going to show you my buttermilk yeast sliders recipe. Here are the ingredients. You can pause and write them down. And hey, if you like our videos, give us a thumbs up and subscribe, and you'll get a notice when I post new videos about twice a week. Now let's get baking. So here are the ingredients. This is 675 grams, about 4 cups of bread flour. I've got a tablespoon of yeast, a tablespoon of sugar, and a tablespoon of salt. And I have 1 egg. I'll beat that up. And then I have 2 cups of buttermilk. And it's been heated up just to get the chill off. It's a little warmer than room temperature. And I've got 6 tablespoons of butter here that I'm letting soften. And then I've got 2 tablespoons of butter that I'm going to melt for brushing. So why buttermilk, you ask? Well, I'll tell you as we go along. First, I'm putting the milk and the sugar and the yeast in here, and I'm going to let it proof for about 10-15 minutes, mostly to see what we get. I'm using instant yeast, so you don't have to proof it. If you're using active dry, you will want to. But I mostly wanted to see what impact buttermilk would have on yeast, because I've never used them together before. And it foamed up pretty much the same as it would have with just regular milk. And I'm going to beat this egg and mix that in now. Back to why I wanted to use buttermilk. I like the flavor, the taste of sourdough bread, but really I'm not good at keeping a sourdough starter. It just takes too much loving care, and lots of days I want some other kind of bread. So I am planning a new starter because I let the last one mold. But in the meantime, I wanted to try the buttermilk to see if it will recreate that flavor. So at this point, I'm going to add in half of my flour. I'm going to eyeball it, about half. And you notice that I'm working in my mixing bowl. In a few minutes, I'm going to switch over to the dough hook. But I wanted to kind of keep tabs on the texture as I go along. So I'm going to start out mixing by hand, and I'll switch to the dough hook when I get this amount of flour mixed in. And by the way, I'm going to put the tablespoonful of salt into the remaining flour and add it as I incorporate the flour in. You're going to have to excuse my stuffy sounding head. I don't have a cold. Things are blooming. My allergies are just acting up. So here we go. I'm just about halfway through the flour. Maybe I'll go a little bit more than half of the flour. And I'm going to keep this at a very loose, very hydrated texture so that it feels kind of gummy, I guess, shaggy, before I put it into the mixer and use the dough hook. It was too loose for the dough hook to even start picking it up before. But you can see what I've got here. Very loose dough. I just want to get everything good and wet. Now we're going to let this sit. Just going to let it rest and bubble and ferment for a little bit. Maybe 45 minutes, lightly covered, before we take the next step. I'll be back. So 45 minutes later, and an hour would not have been too long. I don't know if you can tell, but what we have here, it bubbled and it rose a little bit, and the smell is beautiful. It smells like sourdough bread, like sourdough. So I've put it in my KitchenAid, and I'm going to let that beat down just a little bit, and then I'm going to start adding the rest of my flour. I'll put it in about, I guess, 3 increments so that it beats in really well. I'm going to do some time lapse here and just let you see the texture as I go along. You can see it's mixing up, and I'm going to get in all except about a 1/2 cup of the flour, mixing in as I go. And I'm going to save that last cup, 1/2 cup, to add after the butter. So see the texture we've got. It's very loose still, but it is coming up on the dough hook. And I'm going to start adding the butter just a little bit at a time, about a slice, and incorporate that in. And you know, as you add butter to a dough that's already been mixed, it sometimes sort of breaks the dough down as the oil, the fat, blends in, which is why I saved about a 1/2 cup of flour to add to it later, which will then help pull it back. Well, back together. So just about got all of this butter in. I'll be back when I'm done with the butter. So all the butter's in. We're going to start adding the rest of this flour, which I guess is about a 1/2 cup. I'm just eyeballing it. And I'll put that right on top and let it start to slowly incorporate in. When I get all the flour in, I'll be right back. So I have all the flour in, and I want you to see this is a very loose, very shaggy, kind of gummy dough, and that's okay. I think that's what I want. You saw the photo at the beginning, so I know this works, and it was kind of an experiment. So I'm going to go with this because I think this is going to give me the texture that I want. I'm now going to knead this on speed 2 for about 6 minutes. If you watch my videos, you would know that last week I made some German hard rolls, and I was going for that same texture here, and that's just about what we've got. And we're going to work in just enough flour to get this not so sticky. This is smooth and beautiful, and it's going to be very elastic. Now, you know, I suppose you could add more flour in the mixing bowl to get this to a less tacky texture, but I don't want to add in too much. I want this to be a very soft, well-hydrated dough. So it just works better for me to add that last little bit of flour, to feel it as I go, to know when I get to that texture. And as you're doing this, especially if you're a new bread maker, then you'll get used to the feel of it. You want it to feel elastic and be able to stretch it easily, but to have just enough flour in it that it stops sticking to your hands. And that's how you know you're done with the dough. It doesn't stick to you anymore. And when it gets to that point, which doesn't take very long, then we're going to form it into a ball and get a little surface tension on that ball by turning it and turning it and turning it. And that surface tension, which is real, is not just about me liking to play with dough, even though I do actually like to play with dough. I guess I didn't get to play with clay enough as a kid. But the surface tension helps the bread rise more evenly and a little quicker. Gives you a little more bounce, a little more spring. So have my proofing bowl here, and I hope you can see the texture of that dough. It's very, very soft. Oil in the bottom and flip it a couple of times. And then I'm going to oil the bottom of the lid. It never rises up that much, but just in case it did, then it wouldn't stick. And I'm going to set this aside for about an hour. I'm not going to put it in a warm spot, just room temperature. And after an hour, we come back, and you can see that it's more than doubled in size, and it has what I call the bubblegum texture. I'm just going to punch it down a little bit, pretty gently. You see what I mean by bubblegum? Like silly putty, if you had silly putty when you were a kid. And that's just a wonderful dough to work with. It's so easy. I'm going to work in just enough flour so it's not sticky, because it does hydrate as it sits and rises. So here we go. This just works so well. Now I'm going to weigh this, because what I have here is enough for 18 rolls, and I only want to cook 9 rolls tonight. So I'm going to give it a weigh and cut it in half. And it's too big and floppy just to put it on the scale, so I'm going to put my bowl back. Then I want to cut this into 2 fairly even pieces, and I'll freeze half of it for another night. And you know, there are a couple of ways to freeze dough for later use. You can either freeze it after the first rise, and then when you take the dough out of the freezer to use it, you just let them thaw out, come to room temperature, shape them into your rolls and cook them then. Or you can shape the rolls now and flash freeze the individual shaped rolls, put them in a bag, and take out a couple at a time, put them on a pan, let them thaw and rise, and then bake them. Either way works. It just depends on how you want to use them. So I'm evening these out, and when I get them evened out into 2 fairly even portions, I'm going to divide the one portion I'm going to use tonight into 9 rolls. And I'm going to use the scale to get 9 even rolls. You can eyeball it. I'm just not good at eyeballing it. And so I sort of form it into a square so that I can get close to the right size on my original cut. I figure if I make a 6 by 6 square here and cut it into 2-inch pieces approximately, I won't have so much moving back and forth to do to get them into 9 even pieces. And we'll see how that works. And when you get your 9 pieces separated, take each one and fold it under and under and under like that. And with this very soft dough, it's pretty easy to form them. They stick together pretty well. That's one reason I wanted to keep the dough soft, is because they form more easily into nice rolls if you're working with a soft, fairly moist, fairly hydrated dough. So fold it under and under and pinch it on the bottom, and then rub it in just a tiny little bit of flour. Get that surface tension back, and we should have 9 fairly uniform balls of dough for our rolls, or in this case our little slider buns. I'm doing this because, you know, I have some really good pulled pork, and I wanted to make little sliders. And there we go, the surface tension. Remember the surface tension. You do want to roll it and make sure that it's enclosed at the bottom very well, and you build the surface tension. So I have here my BS&R, that's Birmingham Stove and Range, very old breakfast skillet, and I've buttered it really generously, and I'm going to place these on here so they don't quite touch, and they will rise up and touch. You're going to have a lot of oven spring on this. You could use parchment, by the way, instead of the butter. The cast iron makes a nice crusty bottom, and I'm using these for sliders, so I want a nice crusty bottom. Now I've melted that leftover 2 tablespoons of butter, and I'm going to give a really nice coating of butter on these before I let them rise. Now I let them rise about 25-30 minutes. And while they're rising, I'm going to preheat my oven to 375. I'll cover these in a little plastic. And have I told you how much I hate plastic wrap? And then I'm going to take care of my other dough. So I have another piece of plastic here, and I'm going to put a little flour on it. And I'll put the dough in it and wrap it up. And then I'll put the whole thing in a plastic bag. When I get ready to use it, I'll take it out of the freezer, take it out of the bag in the plastic, let it just come to room temperature, and then I'll fold my rolls, and we'll be right back at that point that we are now, meaning you'll put them in your pan, you'll butter them, you'll let them rise, and then they'll be just like you just made them. And when I open these up, I may want to cut them into 12 pieces and make little smaller dinner rolls, or in 6 pieces and make bigger hoagie rolls, submarine buns. Either way, I can choose at that time, and I'll be back in a few minutes when my rolls have risen up and gotten beautiful and puffy. Like this. Now my oven is preheated. I'm going to put these in the center rack, 375 for about 40 minutes. And this is what we have. Now I want to check the temperature. You want them to be right around 195 to 200 degrees. Someday I'm going to get an instant read thermometer, but for now this one will do. And we're getting right up there to 200. If they were still too cool inside, you'd cook them for another 5 minutes. But we're right on target. I have a little melted butter left. I'm going to put a nice brushing of butter on these to make them good and soft. Don't you think they're pretty? Well, I think they're pretty. And you can smell the buttermilk. One of the reasons I made up my own recipe is because so many of the buttermilk recipes add baking soda to neutralize the tanginess. And I kind of think if you don't want them tangy, then just use regular milk. Gonna let these cool on a rack. Be back. So I let them cool about 15 minutes or so, and I've sliced one, and I'm gonna pile up some pulled pork here and see that nice texture. These are great for sliders. And you know, I was actually trying to recreate like a Crystal or a White Castle bun. These are firmer than that. They're not as soft, but these are wonderful. Got me some chips and a nice dill pickle spear, and I'll take a bite. You know, I'm happy. This is a great meal. Hope you like these as much as I do. I hope you try them, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.